Hello, friends, and welcome back to the next episode in my series, How the Gospels Became History, Jesus and Mediterranean Myths. This is a series that goes chapter by chapter through my book of the same name, published by Yale University Press. I hope that all of you will be able to read the chapters as you go along with these videos. Really appreciate the support. If you haven't checked out the introduction in chapters 1 and 2 to this series, you can already find those episodes free and available on YouTube. Just to remind everybody of the thesis of the book, in my view, the gospel writers use historical tropes to convince their readers that gospel mythoi actually took place, and in this sense were true. Sometimes this thesis has been misrepresented, and I want to lay out what I think carefully here. I don't think that the gospel writers were naive, and I don't think that they considered their readers to be naive. But I think we need to take seriously the religious position of the gospel writers. They, like the Greeks, believed their myths, and they believed that, in general, they actually happened. So I strongly reject any theory that would say that for the evangelists, the resurrection or Jesus walking on water was something that didn't happen. For the gospel writers, the fact that it happened had a bearing on its truth value, so they would not have rejected the idea that it happened. After my general introduction and my discussion of Jesus myth theory in chapter 1 and my own theory of comparison in chapter 2, I get into the meat of the book. And I go step by step through the mythicized life of Jesus. And so I logically begin with the Incarnation. This is just the Latin root for the enfleshment of the Logos, the divine being who became the human Jesus. Simply defined, an incarnation is the strange and often undefined union of a divinity with a human being, or of divinity and humanity narrated in the life of an individual person. And it's useful reminding ourselves that we're talking about the mythicized life of Jesus, and the gospel that really emphasizes this enfleshment of a pre-existing divine being is, of course, the Gospel of John, usually taken to be the latest of the Gospels. But this really tells the story where it begins. That is, it tells the mythicized story where it begins, because for Christians, the story didn't begin 2,000 years ago with the birth of a prophet from Nazareth. It began in eternity past. And so we also, in our mythicized life of Jesus, when we study it, we have to begin with eternity past. Now, in the chapter, I compare Sophia, or the Jewish wisdom figure, with the Logos, and I don't have time to go into that here. Suffice it to say that in giving the general background of the Logos, you often hear of a philosophical background, such as the Logos from Heraclitus or the Logos from the Stoics, informing Christian discourse. But a much more common and broadly known version of the Logos in Greco-Roman lore is Hermes, or the Roman Mercury. Hermes is often simply called the Logos, or the Logos of his father Zeus in Greco-Roman myth. He is the one who brings the message, which is the Logos, and interprets the will of the Father God, in this case Zeus, and so he is often called the Father's Logos, and he is the Logos in terms of his hermeneutical ability, that is his interpretive ability, and he is the Logos in that he gives a message or revelation from the primal deity. And what's interesting is that there are myths of Hermes himself being incarnate in people, or becoming incarnate. And it's often the case that Greek gods have a sort of temporary Incarnation, where they're able to enter into a real and genuine human body, sometimes into animal bodies, and to engage in bodily activities like sex, which indicates that their flesh is, no docetic apparition, but it's the real stuff. But oftentimes this is a temporary sort of a thing. And a good example of this is Hermes in the Iliad, book 24, where Zeus sends Hermes to escort King Priam of Troy to the tent of Achilles so that Priam can redeem the body of his son Hector. And Hermes is shown coming down and taking the appearance, or the form, I should say, of a young man. There's no indication that this young man doesn't have a real body. He comes and he takes Priam's hand and he leads him to the tent of Achilles so that his mission is successful. Now, there's an interesting poem in Horace that portrays the Emperor Augustus as Hermes incarnate. And this, although very idiosyncratic, does show that Greek and Roman people, Greek and Roman writers, I should say, were able to conceive of a longer incarnation for Hermes. So it's not just something temporary. It is the incarnation of Hermes who undergoes a real and full human life and lives as the Roman emperor, and lives as long as the Roman emperor and inhabits the Roman emperor as long as the Roman emperor lives, and only leaves when the Roman emperor dies. This seems to be what Horace is imagining. And it's Hermes who comes from his father Zeus in order to expiate Rome's sin and to lead Rome back into peace after the tragic civil wars. And I think we're meant to not just take this as something frivolous, but as something real. I think a lot of people can dismiss this poem as not widespread belief, and it wasn't widespread belief, but it is simply illustrating that ancient peoples who weren't Christian could imagine a incarnation of a god permanently existing in a human being, a well-known human being, and being born and dying, accomplishing his mission, and in the course of this human life accomplishing the mission of the Father. This is something possible and known before the advent of Jesus and long before the composition of the Gospels. The other main example of Greco-Roman incarnation that I give in the book is the example of Pythagoras, who was, by his followers, widely taken to be an incarnation of Apollo, and specifically the Hyperborean Apollo, or Apollo of the far north, a real deity worshipped. Now, it's sometimes said that the biographies for Pythagoras postdate the New Testament, and that has a seeming plausibility because, of course, the biographies that survive were written by Porphyry and Iamblichus, and these figures are 3rd and early 4th centuries, so long after the Gospels. On the other hand, Porphyry and Iamblichus are depending on and basically rewriting the biographies of the 4th century BCE figures, who in this case are Aristoxenus and Dicaearchus. Now, their biographies don't survive, but the traditions that they passed on were basically absorbed and rewritten by Porphyry and Iamblichus. So this matter is complex. The life of Pythagoras, as we have it surviving, exists in texts which were later than the Gospels. But these texts later than the Gospels are themselves reinstantiations of texts that existed long before the Gospels, in fact, 300 years before the Gospels. And we know that the traditions of Pythagoras as the Hyperborean Apollo were early because Aristotle mentions them again in the 4th century BCE. So this is something to consider. So in the biographies of Pythagoras, we have 2 episodes of epiphany. One epiphany is private and the other is public. The private epiphany is shown to Abaris, and Abaris is himself represented as a Hyperborean, a priest of the Hyperborean Apollo, who comes, supposedly riding on his magic arrow, to Italy in order to meet Pythagoras. And it is Abaris who recognizes Pythagoras as the incarnation of the Hyperborean Apollo and worships him. And Pythagoras, far from denying that insight, lifts up his robe and shows to Abaris his golden thigh. Now, when we think of golden thighs, probably we're tempted to think of rotisserie chicken, but this was a serious and wonderful epiphany, or taken to be so by Abaris, and taken to be confirmation of Pythagoras's divine identity. The other case of epiphany is the public revelation that occurred at Olympia, which is on the Peloponnese in southern Greece. And on this occasion, Pythagoras is either represented as walking or in the grandstand, so to speak, and watching the Olympic Games. And as he rises or as he's walking, people catch sight of the shining gold underneath his robe, and people realize that he is something greater than human. The golden thigh, in other words, is a sign of his divine nature, because gold is incorruptible, like the flesh of the gods. And it's an indication that Pythagoras is incarnating the Hyperborean Apollo. Now, what I argue is that the revelation of Pythagoras' divinity is structurally parallel to the transfiguration scenes in the Gospels. I say structurally parallel, not parallel in terms of content. Obviously, Jesus doesn't have a golden thigh. So, there's not some kind of content or material overlap. But when you look at the structure of how the story is told, for instance, a select few disciples, and one in particular, Simon Peter, comes up with the insight that Jesus is a god, or in this case, the Son of God, something even greater than the Messiah, or some hyped up version of the Messiah, a divine Messiah. This insight is particularly granted to Simon Bar-Yona, that is Simon Peter, and it's given to him by God. He's a close disciple, and in a closed scene, Simon recognizes the divine nature of Jesus, and in the next scene, Jesus gives a confirming sign of his divine nature. In this case, the transfiguration. His skin literally becomes translucent and beams with light, and his face turns brighter than the sun. You know the story. Now, what's interesting is when you get to the Gospels, they're very eager to give what I call historicizing tropes, because they know that this Epiphany scene has been used and reused in past historiographies. And so they want to emphasize its historicities. They give it a definite location, in this case, somewhere in a region around Caesarea Philippi, in a mountain, perhaps Mount Hermon, it's not named. But the region is named as Caesarea Philippi. The eyewitnesses are named. And then when you get to 2 Peter, which is a pseudepigraphical epistle, probably early 2nd century, we have a case where probably 2nd century and quite likely late in the 2nd century, we have Peter, who protests too much about the transfiguration, claiming that he himself was an eyewitness and that he didn't follow what he calls cleverly devised mythoi. So we can tell that there's some kind of apologetic thrust here that the transfiguration scene is being called a mythos, and so the writer of Second Peter feels like he needs to resurrect Peter and, through Peter's own voice, tell people that no, this is not a mythos. This was something seen by an eyewitness at a definite place and at a definite time. And this is a historicizing trope. And the tropes used in the letter Second Peter are simply recapitulations of the narrative tropes that we see in the Gospels themselves. They want this epiphany to seem like a historical event because it is the key and indeed the turning point for the readers to recognize the divinity of Jesus, just as Peter did. So, to review the structural patterns, we have the sequence of confession of the divine nature, whether it be Pythagoras or Jesus, and then followed by some sort of epiphany. The confession is given by a trusted witness, and the epiphany is some sort of enhancement of the flesh, so revealing the divine nature of the incarnated one. And in both cases, we're dealing with something that happens not in a dream or dream vision, but it's something that happens in waking consciousness. And this is another kind of verifying or authenticating factor in this drama. Now, as you know, I can only give the tip of the iceberg in these sessions. So, for all the details and all the further readings and all the notes and all the justification and the citation of ancient sources, go get the book. The full bibliographical information is here. I can put my Amazon page in the description. Check it out and leave a comment and a like. Let me know what you think. I want to learn together with you. One of the reasons I'm doing these videos is so that I can get good comments and feedback. So don't be afraid to leave a comment. If you've benefited, I hope you'll leave a like and consider supporting me further on Patreon, where you can also meet and dialogue with me. I just want to thank everybody for coming along and having a listen. I really appreciate it. It is certainly a labor of love, and I hope that all of you have benefited in some way, and I hope that you keep up the conversation and never stop learning.